It is my pleasure to bring up Eugene Nam, the researcher coordinator at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network, who will be the moderator for our plenary panel. Eugene? Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Welcome to our morning panel. It's titled Minority Stress in the Modern Day. Throughout this panel discussion, we'll be exploring what contemporary issues gay and bisexual men face as stressors. As Ryan mentioned, Victor was unable to attend today, so we're going to have extra time for question period. So I'm going to introduce each presenter. Laurel Nelson is a public health nurse and family nurse practitioner, as well as a scientist in the Center for Urban Health Solutions of the Li Kang-shin Knowledge Institute at the St. Michael's Hospital, and the inaugural holder of the OHTN Research Chair in HIV Program Science with African Caribbean Black communities. He'll be presenting on novel approaches for treating stigma to improve mental health and HIV outcomes in Black gay men. Rahim Thawer is a registered social worker, consultant, post-secondary instructor, and mental health counselor. He has worked at multiple HIV/AIDS service organizations and continued to work in direct practice setting with newcomers, racialized, and LGBTQ communities, including Sherburne Health Center. He'll be presenting on the tensions and implications of casual sex versus long-term relationships. John McCallan has 35 years of experience working in the Ontario child welfare sector and co-founded the Toronto Counseling Centre for Lesbian and Gay, now known as the David Kelly Services. John currently facilitates an ongoing psychoeducational group intervention series at the AIDS Committee of Toronto on healthy aging with HIV. He will be presenting how stigma and discrimination affects the mental health of gay men living in HIV. David Brennan is a social worker and an associate professor at the University of Toronto and the Ontario HIV Treatment Network Research Chair in Gay and Bisexual Men's Health. He is also a director of the Cruise Lab, which produces community-based research that examines the issues related to the health needs of gay and bisexual men, particularly those who are marginalized based on age, race, and HIV status. He'll be presenting his research finding on minority stress and mental health disparity among gay men online. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to talk about this research that involves ways to think about stigma and trauma among Black gay men, what they identify as African Caribbean or Black in the Canadian context, but also in other diaspora communities and in African communities. So you'll hear a lot about stigma today based on sort of the descriptions in the panel, so I'll just spend a few minutes talking about it. So stigma is a major obstacle to HIV care, both prevention and secondary HIV prevention, primary and secondary. For Black gay men or in Black communities, this idea of HIV stigma is not only just about HIV. It's also sort of intertwined with attitudes about same-gender sexual practices, right? The idea that HIV is here because gay men in Black communities are doing things that people don't approve of, that they frown upon, right? So it doesn't even require a gay man, Black gay man, to have HIV to experience HIV stigma. Because even if you're a Black gay man and HIV negative, the idea that you're a gay man in the context of Black communities, people associate the impact of HIV with you just based on your sexuality. So these things are intertwined. There are many domains of stigma. There are many types of stigma. So there is same-gender stigma, HIV stigma, gender non-conforming stigma, but there's also various domains in them. So I'll just touch on them briefly. So felt normative stigma is the idea that many people in my community have this negative attitude towards people like me. Right? Vicarious stigma is the idea that you've heard about things, negative things happening to people like you. Internalized stigma is the belief that you deserve these negative attitudes about you, that you accept it. Anticipated stigma is the idea that something negative will happen to you, whether it's happened or not. and then enacted is the actual discriminatory act, having experienced it in real life. So stigma is not just, how do you say it? People go like, what's the big deal? Everybody has negative experiences in life. Like, why spend so much time focused on it? So the big deal, one of the big deals is that stigma is stressful, right? Chronic exposure to these things actually have physiological impact on people's bodies. So this is just a diagram that shows that psychological stress actually initiates a cascade of inflammatory and immune responses that has impact on people's health, right? So it can make people more vulnerable to infectious diseases. People who have illnesses might have more severe and more frequency of clinical symptoms, and it makes it harder for people to recover from illness when the body is in this chronic state of stress that forces, initiates this immune response. So if we think about how the stress response system should normally work, right? So you're exposed to a stressor and the body reacts. So a bear is chasing you and the body does these things. You get increased adrenaline, you can run faster, your blood pressure is going high, and then the bear, finds somebody else to chase or he gets tired, whatever, so then the response subsides. But think about in a society where the threat does not subside, right? Where racism doesn't go away, where homophobia doesn't go away, where the stigma doesn't subside. So then the body is at this chronic heightened state of stress response that exerts what in literature they call a allostatic load on the body system, right? So the idea of being in a situation where the threat response, the response to stigma is always happening, the body is constantly responding, and actually makes the body systems weaker and more susceptible to infection. So this is just showing that part of what happens is how things from the outside get on the inside, right? So everything we perceive comes through the brain, and the brain responds to that in ways that we don't often see until it's too late, but it manifests itself through inflammatory processes that lead to things like, this is just an example, skin diseases, infections, so on and so forth. So one of my colleagues, Valerie Earnshaw, has studied this, and this is a diagram of her resilience model. And what she found is that stigma actually predicts HIV symptoms in people with HIV, gay men and men and people who aren't gay. But in general, people with HIV have higher symptoms, more severe symptoms, more frequency of symptoms when they've been exposed to stigma. And that the mechanism by which that happens is through stress. She also found that some interventions work for some types of stigma. So this social support, adaptive coping, works to mitigate the pathway between anticipated stigma, like I think something's going to happen to me, and stress. But it doesn't work for enacted stigma, right? When something has actually happened to you, these things don't really have an impact on it. So other life events and circumstances can be traumatic. So for a long time and even now, the diagnosis of HIV was considered a traumatic life event, particularly during the times where it was considered sort of death was imminent. Stigma can be traumatic, homophobia-based violence. We know that stigma contributes to the exacerbation and severity of HIV symptoms, like I mentioned, through the activation of physiological stress responses. And so we need interventions that can interrupt the pathway by which HIV stigma actually exacerbates HIV symptoms. But gaps still remain on the best ways to do that. I did a study in Ghana, we're just wrapping that up now, and we found the same thing that Earnshaw found, is that HIV stigma was associated with HIV symptoms. But it was also associated in this group with not being linked to care and not being retained in care. So that was curious to us. We also found that people who, in this study had very high symptoms. So they had high number of symptoms bothered them more frequently, and they were more severe. But even in the face of these symptoms, most of these guys were not linked to care and were not retained in care, which was puzzling, especially to me as a nurse, because if any of you have ever had any type of symptom, symptoms are a very powerful incentive to seek treatment, right? Because you want it to stop. You want the headache to go away. You want whatever it is to stop. But in the face of these symptoms, these guys weren't seeking care, and we couldn't understand that. In Ghana, if you have HIV, there's a mechanism by which you can get care, and cost becomes less of a barrier. So we talked to people, right? We tried to figure out what's happening here. What we realized from hearing the stories is that it wasn't, how would I say it? When people told the stories, the things that weren't as consequential were vicarious stigma. Oh, I heard this happen to people when they went to this place. Or I think this will happen to me if I go to this place. Or I know most of the people out there think this thing about people like me. It was not getting in care and not staying in care was associated with having been in a place and something happened to you. So what we realized that it wasn't just the event that was making the difference, it was the memory of the event that was making the difference, right? So for a long time, we had thought these events are stressful. You go to a place and a stigmatizing circumstance happens and that is stressful. But for these men, what we were finding is that the sheer memory of the thing that happened to you was stressful. And it was so stressful that they were not willing to risk re-experiencing the event by going back there for care, right? So I didn't study memory, right? I didn't know what to do with this, but I realized that this was an issue. So I partnered with some folks who study PTSD. So what I've learned now is that chronic stress is just as traumatic as traumatic stress. Many times when we think about traumatic stress, we think about catastrophic events, right? I was in a war zone, I saw somebody get their head blown off, or I was raped, right? People can clearly understand how those are traumatic events. But these other events, particularly around stigma, can be traumatic, and the stress symptoms associated with those are consistent with symptoms of PTSD, even without having a catastrophic traumatic life event. So this is just some diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So re-experiencing memories of the traumatic event, recurrent dreams, prolonged psychological distress when you think about the event, sort of what the guys were describing to us, trying to avoid reminders of the event, an inability to remember key aspects of the event, and then aggressive or reckless or self-destructive behaviors as a response to the traumatic stressor. So I'm just going to give you a quick lesson in the last 4 minutes. So this is how it works, PTSD, and what is happening. So the cerebral cortex is the main site for permanent memory storage in the brain. So memories are coded and filed next to memories that are similar to them. But these are sort of time and context dependent, right? The brain sort of gets rid of all the extra nuance that it doesn't need to know and stores the facts in its place. The hypothalamus is the central control center for the brain that also controls emotion, and it regulates visceral functions, like between fight or flight or rest and digest. So two systems are involved, the sympathetic system, which is involved in the fight or flight, or the parasympathetic system. And PTSD results when there's an imbalance between these two systems. The hippocampus is involved in parsing and recording the memories. So this is the part of the brain that says, we don't need to know this, we don't need to know that, here's what is meaningful, and what needs to be stored. So it temporarily saves those experiences there, and then stores them permanently later in the cortex. This is normally done, or this is done during sleep. The amygdala, which is the main site that is involved in PTSD, has a major role in processing emotional reactions. So it bypasses that route that takes the memory from the initial hypothalamus to the cortex of permanent storage and directly encodes it onto the amygdala, right? So this is because in a threatening event, the brain doesn't have time for you to sleep and figure out what this memory is and how to recall it. Like, it's there. It's ready to go when it encounters a threat. So in a routine experience, the hypothalamus evaluates the incoming stimuli and the circumstances, and then it sends it to the hippocampus, which takes out the stuff that it doesn't need to remember and records it. The memory is recorded during sleep through the rapid eye movements that happen when people are in deep sleep, and then it's transferred to the cortex for permanent memory storage, right? This happened, it's in the past, there's nothing to worry about. But in a life or death experience or a threatening experience, which stigma could include as a threatening experience, the hypothalamus evaluates the stimuli and the circumstances, but it doesn't send it to the cortex, right? It recognizes that this is a big problem, so it sends it directly to the amygdala where it gets burned in the circuit system and stored, right? It doesn't get integrated into the cortex for permanent memory storage. So what happens is that the person doesn't recognize that the event is not happening, right? If you ever have even heard stories about folks with PTSD, they can't even describe, why am I doing this, right? Because it's not a conscious process. The body recognizes the brain recognizes it, and it puts people into action, right? So there's a clinical intervention that we're currently working with in Ghana and in Toronto. It's actually going through IRB now, but it's called accelerated resolution therapy. It's an exposure-based therapy that incorporates rapid eye movements as a treatment for PTSD. This came from treatment of PTSD in combat veterans. So we were looking around trying to figure out who's doing work with memory, how are they doing it. This work has been going on for a very long time in the Department of Defense, but it hadn't made it into civilian populations. Actually, the only place in Canada where it was being used was in Alberta with first responders, so firemen or firefighters, police who experience traumatic events. So this is a brief summary of the protocol. So you don't have to have the patient talk about the experience, which is sort of the typical way that you enter into therapeutic processes is tell me what happened. So the person just needs to imagine what happened and recall the images and the sensations. So they imagine what happened either verbally or non-verbally. They go through a process of changing the image, saying this is the negative image that happened, here's the image that you want. And then through the use of rapid eye movements, which we believe mimics what happens during REM sleep, the rapid eye movement, that the memory gets stored from the amygdala where it is and causing these sensations to permanent storage in the cortex. So this is just a graph that shows the results from one of the prospective cohort studies. The red bar is the percentage of people with PTSD symptoms before treatment. The light green bar is percentage after treatment, and the dark green is the percentage 2 months after treatment. So you can see that in each of these categories, all people, age groups, and number of traumas, that a significant reduction in PTSD symptoms were found after people received this treatment. And then lastly, I'll just mention that these are some of the symptoms. All these symptoms were significantly reduced, but in particular, the PTSD checklist, sleep quality was improved, and depression was also decreased, as well as alcohol use on the audit scale. So we're working on this now, and I think we'll have time later on for questions from people, if not now. Okay, thank you.
5-minute question.
Oh, and we have time for questions.
Thank you for that. That was amazing. Just a quick question. You were mentioning the event that caused the patients in Ghana to avoid going back to the clinic. What event were you talking about? Like the experience of their diagnosis or the event of their...
So it's interesting. That's an important question. Much of it was around the diagnosis, right? So, but it was not just the diagnosis. So I can think of an example where the person received the diagnosis, but there was other things that happened around that time. So one very bizarre example in particular was a nurse, a guy who got diagnosed, and he asked the nurse what else could he do to manage his HIV. You know, he sort of dealt with it, and she said, I think you should buy some Pampers. And he said, Pampers? Like, I don't understand why I would buy Pampers. So she said, this activity that you're doing is not, your bottom is not designed for this activity. So if you keep engaging in this thing, how will you maintain strength in that area? How will you control your bowels? I think you should buy some Pampers. So the guy was like, I was confused, like, I would need Pampers. And then he realized, no, she is like stigmatizing me like right here. And it wasn't about the HIV diagnosis per se, but it is happening around the time that he's learning about his diagnosis, that he's figured out what medication he's going to need, and this person is taking him through this experience. And he was 22, and he talked about how humiliating and horrifying it was. And even as he's describing it, you can tell he's re-experiencing some of this anxiety. And he said, I can't go back. The fact that he's having to recall it and tell it to us is already giving him these traumatic-like symptoms, but the idea of going back to any clinic based on what he experienced at that clinic was too much for him. So that's like one example that always sticks out in my head because it's so far out, but most of it is around when they got diagnosed and the circumstances of how they were treated around the diagnosis event.
Wow. Okay, thank you. That's a perfect example. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If there's no question,
So thank you for your presentation. It was really helpful to get a review about how stigma affects our inflammatory systems, PTSD, things of that nature. And there's also, we know that there's a lot of research around HIV and inflammation. And so specific question is, do we know if there's higher inflammatory markers around specifically with men of color, ACP men who are also HIV positive? And what would be some ways that this research could be applied to help decrease those inflammatory markers?
So I don't know if there are specific higher markers among ACP people. Part of what we're studying is whether or not using this treatment to treat PTSD can have a general effect of downregulating inflammation within people. Because the idea is that this inflammatory process is heightened and prolonged. And so this treatment might be able to have people sort of internally downregulate that process, which might have an impact on symptoms. So that's part of what we're studying now, is whether or not this has an impact not just on PTSD symptoms, but on HIV symptoms, if you can reduce the chronicity of those inflammatory processes. The other thing that we're looking at too is, because this has been done, it's probably been done with folks living with HIV, but it's not targeted. This intervention did not target folks living with HIV. So in the study we're doing in Toronto, we're targeting people living with HIV. So we don't know to what degree this intervention might be as effective, assuming that some of those people who take the intervention might have some HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder, right? Because this requires people to access certain parts of their memory, and it requires some degree of cognitive plasticity that we don't know how it might work when you target folks with HIV, either through prolonged medication use or this through the inflammatory process, whether or not this has the same impact that it has had on people, presumably most of them who've not had HIV. So that's part of what we're trying to understand, is how well it works with this population too. Thank you for the question.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That was wonderful. Please join me in welcoming Rahim, please.
Hi, thanks for having me. So today I want to talk about casual sex and long-term relationships and queer guys. Immediately, you might wonder why the heck I'm talking about relationships when this is a panel primarily about minority stress and the various ways chronic stress plays on our bodies. So just at the outset, right, I want us to think about how we think about mental health. Depression, anxiety, suicide, those come up very often, right? Those are diagnostic labels that come with a series of criteria, and they're very, very important to pay attention to. But if we weren't thinking about mental health intervention at a point where we already have a label or we're really, really struggling, what would an exploratory approach to mental health include? I would argue we would be talking about our everyday stressors, our everyday engagements with people and interactions, right? And how do we do that as queer men if we're not talking about our relationships? So I want to talk about the idea that we have conflicting scripts, both from a dominant culture and a subculture that we're grappling with. We pursue, in pursuit of these scripts, both casual sex and long-term relationships, we experience both rewards and challenges, right? If there was no rewards, we wouldn't do it. I would just do the one thing I really like to do, that would feel great, and everything would be good. But I experience conflict, I experience challenges, right? The inner conflict that shows up is maybe what we mean when we say mental health issues of gay and queer guys. And perhaps we fall into a trap. The trap is not research-based or conclusive, but it's something I want to suggest. And then I want us to think about what it means to reconcile these cultural scripts that exist in the landscape where we currently operate. Now, when I initially did this presentation in October, it was about 2 hours long, so we're going to try to do a crash course in 10 minutes. Which is fine. Okay, so first I want to make the argument that we are operating under cultural scripts, right? So scripts are dominant messages that we receive by the cultures and communities in which we operate. So a dominant culture would be like a heterosexist or heterosexual or heteronormative script, right? So we get messages that we then internalize, or we have to engage with at least. Subculture would be our queer community, and in all honesty, when I'm talking about queer community, what I'm really talking about are the norms that are set out or the messages that we receive in cis gay men's communities. So if I wanted to explore or navigate casual sex, a message that I might get from my dominant culture is that casual sex is something that's fun, but it tends to happen before you meet the right person, right? It happens, there's this idea of chronology or sequence and when this shows up in our life. My subculture tells me that casual sex is an important part of the culture in which we operate over the lifespan. It's connected to my liberation. It doesn't preclude long-term relationships, and I can meet the right person and still have casual sex, right? So I get a bit of a conflicting message. When I'm thinking about wanting a long-term relationship, now a long-term relationship is complicated, particularly in our community. I would break it up into subsections of when I'm seeking and trying to find somebody, when I've met somebody and we're in the beginning phase of our relationship, and then arbitrarily at this point when we call it a long-term relationship. There's different messages in each area. So I think my dominant culture tells me that a long-term relationship signifies maturity. Right? I'm ready for it in a particular way. I'm settling down. That's some of the language that gets used. When people come into counseling and they talk about sexual compulsion or sexual addiction, I always have to take a step back because I want to know, what do they mean by that, right? Not because that's not real or doesn't exist, but often because I think what they're grappling with is their desire to have casual sex, but a message from the dominant culture that says monogamy is not only a signifier of maturity, but that it signifies self-control over your desires. You've gotten to a particular point in your life where you're able to make this choice. And that's a difficult message to grapple with. Because if I transcend that or challenge that, I'm seeing myself as having a disorder. My subculture tells me long-term relationships are hard to find and maybe not essential, right? I can measure my milestones in the world, my progress, my success in other ways. That's the message I get. And a message of resistance I get is also that monogamy, particularly as one form of long-term relationship, is for straight people. So this leaves me in a difficult place, right? If I want to resist heteronormativity and say monogamy is for straight people, then perhaps I'm without a relationship. And if I want a relationship, but also want casual sex, well, then I'm thinking I don't have the self-control or I'm lacking maturity. So my argument here is that we're messaged to from two different systems that we're socialized into. And those systems give us different messages that materialize into scripts that we then internalize, and they create conflicts. So why can't I resolve this conflict? Usually when we have a conflict, right, we have a kind of cognitive dissonance, and then we find a way to resolve that conflict, right? So I justify or I come up with a reason or an explanation for why I am the way I am. But it's more challenging than that. So some of the rewards I get when I'm looking for casual sex, and when I say I mean often us as gay men as well, I'm looking for rewards for my self-esteem, right? It makes me feel good. Being desired makes me feel good, right? I feel validated. And maybe I need validation from multiple people and multiple sources, and that's important to me. The connection I get from casual sex feels very, very valid, right? And so I want to keep doing that. And I don't know about you, but my moves in the bedroom have changed in the last 10 years, right? So my sexuality is evolving with each person I meet and with each developmental milestone that I reach. So as my sexuality is evolving, I'm also interested in exploring it with other people. So those are some of the rewards we get from pursuing casual sex. What's challenging about casual sex? Well, navigating hookup apps can be complicated, can also be fun, but then I have to deal with things like racism. I have to be forced to do this kind of explicit communication about what I'm into, right? Otherwise, I'm that guy who says, hey, 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 and then I don't meet up with you because I don't know how to say what it is I want. There's a skill there, and it's challenging. I have to manage rejection and shame. So some of us are really, really good at managing rejection. Someone says, no, I'm not into you, and I say, hey, no problem. I'm in this sphere. The rules of the game are different. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm going to argue that sometimes we do take it personally. Sometimes we do feel it deeply. And particularly over time, Depending on how you show up in the world, you experience disproportionate levels of rejection compared to other folks, right? So that's a huge challenge. It also gives rise to body consciousness, right? So I'm not attacking people who go to the gym. Going to the gym is great. I also go to the gym. Doesn't always look like it, but I do endeavor to, right? But in this realm of new rules and new norms, there's a capitalist sense of competition that shows up. And the way I compete is by using my body as a vehicle. And that puts an enormous pressure on my body. When I think about the rewards of long-term relationships, well, those of us who've been in long-term relationships can attest to these. I get to meet other couples in a very new way, right? They see me in a new way. They want to do things with me. I get to participate in activities. I suddenly get invites to things I didn't get invites to before. Another function of long-term relationships, for me particularly as a queer person, is that I get to introduce my partner to my family, right? That's very, very important. It legitimizes my queer identity in particular ways. It makes my queerness very visible. Oh my goodness. Sorry. It legitimizes my queerness in very particular ways. But it also comes with challenges, right? Long-term relationships in our communities are complex, and people often say the spaces to meet people are limited. Depending on how I feel about monogamy or openness, or the model of relationship I subscribe to, or the tools I have to make the model I'm interested in happen, I might be mourning the loss of a single life, right? In a community and culture where sex is readily available. I might have a lot of difficulty talking about the specifics that come with negotiating an open relationship. And that's not just skills-based, right? It brings up shame, it brings up trauma, it brings up our attachment issues. So what do I do with these conflicting scripts? I'm going to say that it's nearly impossible to pursue either casual sex or relationships, or long-term relationships, without some personal or external criticism that gives rise to internal conflict, right? And so if I'm pursuing casual sex, right, and something negative or complex comes up for me, shame, for example, I have casual sex, I feel a sense of disgust. Instead of working that out, right, maybe I defer to seeking long-term relationships, right, because that signifies a kind of security and maturity. And it's not just in my head, my culture tells me so. If I have a negative or complex experience pursuing a long-term relationship, whether it's in the beginning, middle, or long-term stages of that relationship, instead of working out what's coming up in the long-term relationship, my go-to might be a flight response, right? I want to leave, I want to end this right now, I want my autonomy and I want my freedom again. So here's my question. Are gay men's mental health issues, right, in part, an adaptive response to our culture's demand that we navigate each of these imposed scripts? And is it a result of the challenges that accompany each script? So what I'm saying here is, if I'm experiencing depression or anxiety, is it because I'm having challenging navigating these two scripts and the conflict it brings up? And is it just the result of navigating this terrain? So what does that look like visually, right? This idea of the trap, where I don't work out one thing in one domain and I defer to another. Well, I'm thinking about casual sex, right? I might think about the body consciousness or body image issues that come up. My relationship to substances might change in that context. My relationships, my kinship models might not be recognized. I might experience a lot of rejection. So I might not have the space to work that out, right? There isn't a space necessarily to work that out. Right? I could go to the sexual health clinic, but I can't dive into that right away. Maybe I can. I'm going to say it's unlikely, right? And so then I defer and I figure it out myself. I'm just going to look for a long-term relationship. And here are all the things that show up when I'm trying to work that out. And if I can't work that out successfully because I don't have the support, I don't have access to resources, people in my community give me conflicting messages, I tend to bounce between these two scripts. And then I fall into a bit of a trap. So the question I want to pose to us is, how do we come up with reconciled scripts? How do we come up with ways of talking about relationships that reflect the models we're interested in? So is it possible to feel great about casual sex and long-term relationships without hierarchizing them? what does sex-positive affirmative support look like when casual sex brings up difficult feelings, right? So how can I assure that my practitioner, the person I go to, is not going to say, well, if casual sex makes you feel bad, have you considered a long-term relationship? That's not helpful, right? That reiterates a dominant script that I'm already struggling with. That is where my shame originates. That's not helpful. How can we talk more about the pressures that accompany seeking and finding forms of connection? Because that terrain is incredibly complex. And we're all implicated, right? We're all struggling with those things. And if we think about the context of competition and capitalism, we all have a place in a hierarchy. So what is it like when I talk to a practitioner, a therapist in particular, who I perceive to have more cultural, sexual, or social capital, right? What does that transference look like? They don't teach you that in school. They teach you a 7-column CBT scale, which is helpful to reduce symptoms, but it doesn't allow us to examine something deeper, right? And that's what I'm desperately wanting. Sorry, I say I, but I'm not lying. It is very personal. And lastly, right, how can we articulate new relationship models that actually speak to our complexity, right? And I have to say, HIV prevention and treatment has a part in this, but for a long time, our prevention messages have had to, in an algorithmic flowchart way, connect back to HIV prevention and treatment. So if we're going to embrace syndemics, I think we can have a campaign, we can have a conversation that talks just about body image, that talks just about the complexity of relationships, that talks just about our everyday terrain, of which HIV experience is one component, right? Where we're not forced to reiterate and legitimize what our issues look like in relation to HIV prevention. Thank you very much. Eugene, do we have time for questions?
I'll spend about a couple minutes for questions.
Nobody has a question about relationships?
I have a question for you.
I don't believe you.
I have a question for you. Sure. So you say you actually work with newcomers.
Yes.
So when newcomers come to Canada, oftentimes they're not really aware of those script that we're talking about. And oftentimes newcomers may feel a little bit disempowered navigating the sexual landscape or negotiating sex and et cetera. How do you support newcomers?
Thank you for that question. So my work is incredibly individualized, and so I really have this honor and opportunity to ask people what it is they think what they're expected to do, what they think is expected of them, and we analyze their assumptions going into various relationship dynamics. And I think you're right, there is sometimes a miss in terms of what people are expecting and putting out there and what they get back, right? But we all, these cultural scripts, I would argue are so, they're so entrenched that we all experience a process of being acculturated, right? So what that means is there's a process whereby we're socialized to learn what they are. And sometimes that acculturative process is incredibly painful. So working with some newcomers, people will say things like, I thought this was going to be a long-term relationship because he said this, or we did this, or because we spent X amount of time together. And then they recalibrate. And I would argue that as a person born here and not a newcomer, part of my acculturative process was to learn about the norms in the mainstream cis gay men's community and how that script differs and how it looks different. We attach differently, we negotiate space and relationships differently than what we've been taught in hetero-dominant spaces. So I think that acculturative process is slightly different for newcomers because I think it comes with more vulnerability around access to resources and supports. But I don't think it's that different than the acculturative process a lot of queer guys have to go through. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, one more question. Hi, Rick.
Oh, that's for me.
Yeah. In terms of the negotiating, one of the biggest issues I come across in talking about relationships with men is the definition of monogamy. There seems to be 150 different definitions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's something that you come across a lot as well.
All the time. Thank you. That's a beautiful question. I think no one is going to be in a position to concretely say what defines a long-term relationship, what is monogamy, what isn't. I think one of the things I see anecdotally is that there's a lot of folks who are in open relationships or pursuing other models of non-monogamy, but we don't talk about them. There aren't enough cultural representations of what that looks like. Because I think when people actualize them in their lives, they can look like many different things. I've met some couples who explicitly talk about every single rule in their relationship, and that's very important to them, and that really works. And so there's skills there that I think we need to work on and really articulate. And then there's some folks who don't do all that much talking in terms of negotiating openness, and the relationship is fine, you know? So I think there's different models and different definitions that people bring to their relationships, and I would want to ask them, right? How do you define it, and what does it mean to you? Because I don't think we have skills to talk about that, because in many other contexts, it's not expected. I think when I think about the idea of internalizing a dominant script, we think about chronology or a sequence of events, and we're just like, this comes first, then this comes first, and this comes first. And so we need more tools to talk about those things. So thanks.
Next presenter is John.
I'm not going to use slides. Can I move this like somewhere down? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Thanks. So hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk with you today. I'm actually going to speak about HIV-related stigma on the mental health of gay men living with HIV, and in that sense, I'm going to build on some of the things that Laurent has said. But however, I'm not an academic, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to present findings from academic research. In fact, what I plan to do is discuss HIV-related stigma from the perspective of my experience as a gay man living and aging with HIV, and from the work that I do at ACT, leading support groups for mainly gay guys living with HIV. So we're living at a very significant time in the HIV epidemic. We now have evidence-based tools for HIV treatment and prevention that are so effective that they could conceivably end the most deadly disease epidemic in modern history. Today, if your HIV is diagnosed promptly, and if you have access to treatment, you can live a long and healthy life. And because HIV treatment is so effective and reduces your viral load to undetectable levels, there isn't any risk of passing on the virus during sex. And those same medications that keep me healthy and alive are also highly effective in preventing HIV transmission when taken by HIV-negative people who are vulnerable to HIV. Just consider what a huge leap that is from the situation in the 80s and early 90s. Back then, an HIV diagnosis was still considered a death sentence, and the only prevention tool we had was the consistent and correct use of condoms. Yet, despite this progress, HIV remains one of the most stigmatized of all medical conditions. And if you need proof, just look at the comments under any online story about HIV or that appears in the media. For many of us who live with HIV, it's the stigma we face that now provides the greatest challenge in our lives. That's the message I hear all the time from the guys who've attended the support groups I facilitate. Attitudes towards people with HIV really haven't progressed as rapidly or as positively as the medical treatment has. In a national survey conducted in 2012, 48% of Canadians said they'd feel uncomfortable drinking from a restaurant glass that had been used with a person with HIV. 51% said they'd be uncomfortable if a family member or a friend dated someone who was HIV positive. And 60% said they were uncomfortable with HIV because they thought it was still fatal. But these perceptions and attitudes are not limited to the general public. Sadly, some of the most potent expressions of stigma towards HIV-positive gay men comes from within the gay community itself. Gay men like me who have HIV, who dare disclose our status on dating apps, would likely have at least some experience of rejection as a result. But people won't only make judgments about you if you disclose to them, they'll be even more judgmental if you don't disclose to them. The language that some people use about people like me is truly horrendous. We're blamed for contracting HIV in a way that people wouldn't dream of blaming somebody who gets cancer because they smoke. And we're routinely vilified as predatory and irresponsible guys by too many of our HIV-negative brothers. But people living with HIV don't just face stigma in dating and intimate situations. We can also face stigma and discrimination daily in just about every aspect of our lives. Discrimination in the workplace remains a key barrier to employment and loss of employment because exclusion from the workplace remains widespread despite any anti-discrimination laws or policies that may exist. Stigma can lead to a lack of educational opportunities. It can result in abandonment by a spouse or a romantic partner or by family members, and in social and personal ostracism. It can be expressed by stigmatizing language and behavior, verbal harassment, and even violence. And it can place limits on housing, restrict travel, prevent participation in religious and cultural ceremonies. And the overly broad use of the criminal law in the case of the non-disclosure of HIV status perpetuates stigma and discrimination, as both the federal and the Ontario governments have recently come to recognize. But it's also important to remember that HIV-related stigma and discrimination doesn't apply to all people living with HIV equally, because HIV stigma intersects with other pre-existing stigmas, including those based on gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, race, ethnicity, immigration status, income, and stigmas associated with particular behaviors and activities like substance use and sex work. And this can have a serious impact on the physical and mental health of people living with HIV. In my groups at ACT, I listen to HIV-positive gay men consistently talking about how the stigma they experience or anticipate is associated with high levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. And many say that they engage in avoidance strategies, limiting their engagement to just a few people they feel they can trust. And this often leads to loneliness. It impacts the quality of our lives, our mental outlook, our sense of being happy and fulfilled people. And when these stigmas are internalized, as they often are, they can have an equally damaging effect. Negative self-judgment can result in shame, a feeling of worthlessness and self-blame. And self-stigma limits a person's ability to live positively, limits self-agency, quality of life, adherence to treatment, and access to health services. And HIV stigma also affects HIV-negative gay men because it hampers HIV prevention efforts. When we're unable to talk openly and honestly about HIV, we're unable to have those important health-related conversations that can prevent transmission. And people may be less likely to test when the dread of acquiring HIV becomes too great. And as a result, they'll be too late to access treatment that will both extend their lives and make them uninfectious to their sexual partners. So that's a long list. So what can we do to end HIV stigma? It isn't easy. But I'd suggest we place emphasis on 6 approaches. First, involve people living with HIV and key affected populations, which means the whole gay community, in the design, implementation, and monitoring of programs. and strengthen those networks of people living with HIV as key players and key actors in effective stigma reduction efforts. This is the key principle of the HIV movement, the JIPA-MIPA principle, the greater involvement and the meaningful engagement of people living with HIV in our programs and services and policy and research. Secondly, recognize that HIV-related stigma and discrimination intersects with other forms of stigma, discrimination, and disadvantage. Thirdly, educate and raise general public awareness, knowledge levels about HIV, including effective education on transmission risk, and dealing with the fears and misconceptions about HIV. Fourth, engage community, political, and religious leaders to foster greater openness about sexuality, and that really is an approach that I think is going to be particularly crucial in the run-up to the provincial election in June, where we have one of the party leaders saying that they're going to withdraw the sex education curriculum that we now have in our schools. Fifthly, ensure staff members within the healthcare and social service settings provide care that's non-discriminatory, maintains confidentiality, meets the needs of key populations, such as gay men, and is respectful of human rights. And finally, address those harmful criminal laws that fuel stigma and discrimination against marginalized groups and people living with HIV, including the overly broad use of the criminal law with respect to the non-disclosure of HIV status. Living with HIV is not as bad as it once was, and we should welcome the fact that it's no longer a death sentence, but ignorance, prejudice, and fear continue to combine to make it much worse than it need be. So that stigma doesn't just hurt people living with HIV, it really hurts us all. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Hi.
Hi, Vincent.
Hi, how are you? I have a question because recently Casey House did a big in the TTC Midea Campaign, and I have a lot of respect for Casey House, and it has such mixed feelings regarding this campaign. That says it was like this campaign, I saw it a few weeks ago, so in 2018, saying you cannot you cannot attract HIV by sitting on the same seat as someone HIV positive that took the TTC, and I was just wondering what your opinion on is like in 2018 having this sort of like campaign. I was wondering, do you think it prevents stigma or it like gives more stigma by acknowledging that some people still seriously think that? I don't know if my question is clear.
It's a very good question actually, and unfortunately, as I said earlier when I was quoting those stats, the level of ignorance amongst the general public remains very low. And so I think there is a need to have those kind of conversations. But as a guy living with HIV, when I see that stuff, it kind of says to me, well, they don't want to come near me because they might get it from me, or I must be an unfortunate person, when I actually don't feel I'm unfortunate at all. But it's very comparable to the message I think we give in HIV prevention messages. We say, or we have traditionally said to people, you don't want to get HIV whatever you do. But then once you seroconvert, if you do, then the message is very different. Oh, don't worry, everything will be fine, your life can be normal. So there's that kind of tension that I think. So I think those messages are necessary. I just think we need to do it in a way that doesn't stigmatize those of us who are living with HIV and those of us who are vulnerable to HIV. Yeah.
One of the things I really liked about what you talked about is you talked about how we can't even talk about sex, and so it's hard to prevent HIV stigma when we can't talk about these kind of sexual stigma that happens against people living with HIV. And that I think also just perpetuates negative attitudes that even HIV negative people can have about themselves, but especially people living with HIV. But it also seems like there's little appetite in some organizations, some there's more and some there's less, to even talk about sex or have those conversations. So HIV positive people, you can talk about your symptoms and you can talk about coping. HIV negative people can talk about prevention, but there's no intertwined part. What do you think we need to be doing in the mental health sector and actually also in the HIV service sector to break down those barriers a bit more? And is talking about sex a part of it in your belief?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think talking about sex and pleasure and intimacy all together. I mean, we normally talk about sex as a physical act that I might enjoy. It might be dangerous because it could be violent too. But sex as a pleasurable activity is something we don't often talk about. And we've had this discussion over the years when we talk about, when we have in the days when we still felt that people like me were walking viral time bombs and were dangerous. There was this discussion around that we only were allowed to have sex with condoms. And believe me, when you're my age and you try to have sex with condoms of 30 years non-stop, it doesn't work. And it's no pleasurable. So I think we need to begin to have those honest conversations and talk about sex and intimacy and pleasure and not just disease prevention. Thank you, Trevor. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Our last presenter is David.
So if you need to fix your hair or your makeup, do so quickly because I'm going to take a picture from up here for my mom. It's not going on any social media because my mom has no idea about social media. But how do I find the slide? Sorry. But I told her I was speaking to the most beautiful audience in all of Toronto. And she said, I don't believe you. Take a picture. So smile. Say hello to Kathy. Evidence. Okay, awesome. Thanks, folks. Me and my red pants are very glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking to you, that's for Trevor. I'm going to be talking to you about just some findings from, some preliminary findings from our iCruise study. Some of you may be very well aware of where we're at with it. Some of you are probably like, what? What is that? So I want to highlight that there's quite a number of the members of the research team here today, including Trevor Hart, Barry Adam, Dane Griffiths, Travis is here as well. I need to correct your name, and Daniel as well. So we have kind of a very actively engaged research team and staff. Liam is here as well from our cruise lab, and members of our advisory board. So what I wanted to do is just present to you today we decided to sort of jump into the data. We're actually still collecting data, but we decided to jump into the data to kind of have an opportunity to talk about some of the factors we were looking at in the data on minority stress and mental health outcomes. The overall study is really to look at how gay and bisexual men are using online tools, apps, and websites, and all the things that you put online to see whether or not it's whether or not they're engaging with this with these pieces of information and communities in a way that's kind of helping to address health and mental health. In order to be in the study, people had to identify as male, cis or trans is fine, had sex in the past year, or identify for very young guys to be romantically interested in other guys, or to identify as some of our sexual minority boxes that we check off as gay, bisexual, queer, two-spirit. They had to be at least 14 years of age and live, work, or visit Ontario pretty frequently. The only data collection I'm going to report on now is our baseline data collection, which we did over a 2-week period. And then people have also, we're still wrapping up the data collection of people giving us weekly diaries about where they've gone and what they've been doing over the last week online, and a follow-up, as well as a follow-up interview for some of our participants to get some nuanced data. We recruited people from August through just this past month. We're done with recruitment. And so what I'm talking about now is the analysis we've done on people who've completed both of the baseline questionnaires. So they've completed our baseline, and we have 860 guys in that sample. A little bit about the statistical methods, just in terms of trying to look at some of the associations between depression, which we measured through a standardized scale, the PHQ-10, and anxiety disorder, which is actually a self-report measure, not a standardized measure. And then we looked at some socio-demographic variables as well as mental health outcomes. So one of the scales we looked at is something called the Everyday Discrimination Scale. Some of you may have seen this. Have you experienced kind of a whole list of possible discriminatory acts or experiences in the course of your regular life? And then at the end of that, we asked people to check off, like, was it based on race? Was it based on sexual orientation or HIV status? I don't have all those details, but for people who reported everyday discrimination, what we did is we took the range of scores and we put them into quartiles. So the lowest 25%, the next 25%, the third 25%, and the top 25%. What you can see from this, does it look blue and orange to you? I don't know if it's orange or red. It's different. So, but anyway, what you can see from this is that there's sort of a linear process happening here, where you certainly can see that people who are reporting high levels of everyday discrimination, about half of them are also experiencing depression and anxiety disorders. Same thing, we looked at social interaction anxiety and social phobia scales. So we know, as some of my amazing colleagues here have talked about, how we can isolate ourselves, become disconnected from others, which of course impacts our mental health. And so same thing here, to look at these scales about anxiety and self-report. And what we see is that people in the highest quartiles are experiencing the highest levels of depression and anxiety. We also decided to kind of modernize a lot of experiences of homophobia scales. Used to be things like, were you called a fag, were you beat up, things like that. But actually, the way it kind of works now is, do you see the hashtag no homo? Or are people saying, do you hear constantly around you, that's so gay, which is more considered a microaggression because it's not necessarily targeting you specifically, but it is, of course, sending a message about what it means to be gay. And so we have a microaggression scale. And again, what you can see is that the people who are reporting the highest levels of these kinds of microaggressions are also reporting the highest levels of depression and anxiety disorder. I don't have all the, I do have the tables, but they're really ugly and overwhelming. But basically, for you to just see that what we're looking at, the higher levels of minority stress variables, so experiences of microaggression, everyday discrimination, and these kind of anxieties, what you'll see is that the youngest guys across the board are experiencing the highest levels of this. People who have a sexual orientation other than gay or bisexual, people who identify as being single or in polyamorous relationships as opposed to being coupled, which is an interesting link to Rahim's work, those with a lower education and lower income as well. Non-white racial identity had much higher rates of everyday discrimination, and unemployment was more associated with people who were reporting social interaction, anxiety, and phobias. So what we wanted to do was then see, okay, people who are experiencing this, are they going online and accessing the great work that many of you are doing and putting online, or that you're aware of, to get information about mental health and addiction? And what you can see, again, going back to that microaggression scale is, in the last 3 months we asked, have you gone online to get information about mental health and addiction? And so what you see is that, nearly 2/3 of the guys in the top levels of having experienced microaggression are actually engaging with online tools and information. So the what to do is very important, because what information are they actually interacting with? Like, is it actually helpful information? And who's putting that information out, and what are the messages are very important to consider. Also, in the last 3 months, have you gone online to get information on mental health and addiction for those based on your score related to social interaction anxiety or social phobia? And again, you can see nearly 3/4 of people experiencing anxiety are trying to access information online. Finally, the people who've reported everyday discrimination scale, and what we could see across the board is people who are not experiencing that very much are not using it as much or accessing online information. There's not a direct line across, but you can see that the numbers get high as there is an increase in experiences of everyday discrimination. So one of the things I've always wanted to know is whether or not the apps that people are using, that you have on your phone, many of you right now, that maybe you're looking at right now. See if I'm in there, say hi. Send me a sup, that's cool. Anyone see Schitt's Creek this week? Golden moment about that. Okay, to see if people are interested in finding out about health information on the apps. Very initially, many of the app providers were very anti-public health or anti-including any kind of health information until we started hammering them with numbers that say, these are your participants. Do you want them all to, experience depression, anxiety, loneliness, isolation, HIV, STI, no access to care or treatment? Is that really what you want? And basically, initially, they said, yeah, we don't care, unfortunately. In fact, many of them I had a little nickname for. Can I say it here? App holes. Yeah, basically. So, but in truth, what's happened is most of those apps have actually been trying to come around to think about how we can actually integrate things into the context of the work that they're doing. Some of them are amazingly better than others, and so that's one of the things. So one of the pieces of information I want to show to them is this. If people are experiencing everyday discrimination, are they likely to try to access information on mental health substances within your app? And what you can see again here is that it's certainly particularly for mental health information that yes, people would like to have access to that information inside the app. The trope from the app is that we don't want to disrupt a user's experience. People come on, they want to hook up, they want to get laid, they want to have a good time, they don't want to hear about condoms or mental health, blah, 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 blah. But we're showing that actually maybe that's not true. And so many people use apps. I have, out of sheer boredom, loneliness, so there obviously are people engaging with this information online. So this is specific to people who've experienced the everyday discrimination scale, but the numbers are the same or similar. There's similar patterns in terms of people experiencing social interaction anxiety and other social phobias. And again, as well, I think the numbers are even a little higher for people who are experiencing microaggressions. So this is the kind of information I want to bring to some of my colleagues. There's an organization called Building Healthy Online Communities that goes through the California STD. I don't know their name. It's really long. It has California and STD in the title. Dan Wolfeiler, I probably should have put it up here, but I can find it for anybody who would like me to, that are trying to figure out ways to engage with building healthy online communities. And finally, just the last couple of slides are really about how often, how important is it for you to be able to access health resources on the internet. And particularly, we asked people who reported that they were experiencing high levels of anxiety. And you can see, again, a little bit of a linear climb in terms of it being very, very, very important. And lastly, one of the most important things is, like, if you're on an app right now, good for you. I'd love a report. But if you're on an app right now, do you have privacy to have a conversation? Can you say, are you in a place where you can say, hey, where do I get tested? Or somebody came in my eye, am I going to get HIV? Or whatever it might be, right? Like whatever the question is. So how often do you feel like you can have those conversations? And you can see that as people are dealing with depression, which could, of course, be a proxy on some level for social disconnection. It can also be a proxy for loneliness. That it's, people are less likely to feel like they can have those kinds of private conversations. So that's something that we'd have to figure out with app providers, like how do we ensure privacy? And of course, that's a whole thing about what they are trying to do. That is what I got to say for now. My email address is there in case anyone wants to reach out to me regarding anything. We're almost done with the data collection. We're still collecting the last round of diaries. We should be finishing over the next month or so, and then with the follow-up interviews for our participants. Some of you may be our participants. Thank you very much for your time and effort and attention to our work. So I'm glad to take any questions. Yes. Andrew in the house.
That was a great presentation, David.
Thanks, Andrew.
I'm curious, how receptive, or did you have any engagement with the apps themselves in terms of doing this work and having conversations about that piece?
Yes and no. How to answer that? So initial outreach to apps about trying to do this kind of work, which took place at a meeting at the UN AIDS office, actually, in Geneva, trying to think about how we could be employing these apps more for mental health reasons, not just HIV and STI, but thinking more syndemically, was met with like thunderous good luck, right? Which is where that nickname came from, because I walked away from that meeting really, really frustrated. However, there have been enough people who sort of say, wait a minute, hold on. Are you part of this community? What, you are? Oh, well, how'd you like to think about your community in a different way? So Grindr now has Grindr Equality. Hornet has actually gone very aggressively around trying to develop new and emerging ways of engaging with people online. There was a program of having an online counselor in Planet Romeo in Germany that never got off the ground because it wasn't sort of merging. There is definitely a little bit of a come around. The bottom line for the apps is that we live in a capitalist society, and so they have to make money. So if 10 people complain about something that's on that app, they're going to shut it down. And most of the agencies that I know of, not naming any names, kind of surreptitiously figure out how to engage online with users online, with members online. But they don't like it, and they will very quickly shut things down. Again, however, there's a slight change to that in trying to think about how easy it could be to just have a little bubble or some other way to say, hey, are you interested in talking about mental health? Bing! Without it having to be you who, are working for an agency that maybe doesn't have so much money, or me trying to squeeze everything I can into research dollars, but use their resources to leverage that kind of access. So I'll take a second to just plug that we did just get funded through CIHR to do a Catalyst grant with Hornet, where we're looking at trying to develop a peer model within the app. So in Toronto specifically, as a pilot, to see if we can identify people who would be willing to act as kind of health ambassadors, we're not sure of the language, that will go through a training with ACT, get some support, and be able to sort of be visible on the app as someone who's willing to tell their story and trying to highlight specific stories, like older folks who are living with HIV, people who are living long-term with HIV, people who are undetectable, people who are positive and detectable, negative guys who are on PrEP, that being willing to kind of talk about their experience as they're just cruising about the app, right, if they would be able to be visible. So we're really excited about that project because I think because it's peer-based, it's community-led, it's community-engaged, we're hoping that that could move something forward. So there are little openings that are definitely occurring, at least from my perspective. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, great. Thanks. Kathy Brennan, thanks you.
Thanks, David. It's not quite 12 o'clock yet, so we do have 10 minutes. If you guys have any burning questions that you didn't get to ask, it's your time.
Hi, sorry, I'm really bad with names. You in the middle, sir. Wondering, how can we talk about HIV/AIDS prevention in a non-stigmatizing way? Because I totally agree that it's kind of this like, don't get AIDS, don't get HIV, oh my God, oh, you have it, you're fine. They're totally right that this is, so how can we really talk about prevention, but kind of keeping that, yeah.
How does this turn on? Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes, good. So that's a very good question. And I think you start where the client is, right? And you listen to them and you talk and using their language. The other thing is that I think when we talk of stigma, the language you use is very important. So, for example, I hope one wouldn't say, if I came to you and I said, oh, I've just got HIV and I'm very scared, that you wouldn't say to me, oh, I'm sorry, right? You would say, do you have a good doctor, for example? Or if I, and then the next question would be, well, I mean, yes, that's, I've lost my other question, but I think it's basically starting where the client is or where your friend is, and you take the cues from them.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Hi. While you're walking, I'm just going to make one point. For those of you who are members of any of the hookup apps, you have power. You're a member. You can vote with your feet, and you can give messages back to the people who run the apps. So if you're having a bad day and you're on the app and you're feeling like, gosh, it would be great if there was something here, it's also okay to communicate that to those providers. In truth, it's the only way they're going to listen, because your money is really what drives the process. So.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. I'm too short for this microphone. I can't believe it. Thank you, everyone. It was so interesting. It was a fantastic panel. My question is for you, Laron. I thought it was so intriguing talking about ART therapy. And you said it was only available in one place in Canada, and thank you. That's great. Now, probably much louder. In Alberta, in terms of responding, first responders. But what is it about that particular therapy you think that has made it sort of limited? How does that get more broadened out? Is it training? Is there something happening here in Canada in terms of what people are thinking about ART therapy? Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. Okay. I think it's just because much of how a lot of folks do their work is siloed, right? The only way I learned about it was because I went looking other places. Like, I didn't find out about anybody who does work in HIV or LGBT health, right? I was talking to people who do work with PTSD. So these are folks who do work with combat veterans. So it's not that it's secret. I think folks sort of get trained, they learn particular techniques. I like the comment you made about the CBT. So that's just how these disciplines raise their practitioners and their scholars. And so I just don't think people have looked in other places for other answers. There's no reason why it couldn't be done more in Toronto. There's training that's available through this. I can't think of the name of the center, but we sent people there to be trained. I just think it's how we sort of learn how to apply our disciplines, and we're not looking at other places for where other folks have found answers. I think we are sort of stuck sometimes in a particular place that leads us to the same methods that sometimes work and sometimes provide limitations.
Can I ask a follow-up? Did you find, because you're from the States, right? So is it more broadly available there? Is it something that's sort of got better support? Or is it the same sort of silo
It's
situation?
the same situation, yeah.
Okay.
It's mostly through, if you go to Veterans Hospital or you go to Army base, it's everywhere. But outside of that, it's not getting wide use. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Raheem, I have a question for you. Thank you first for your presentation. I was really interested in what you were saying about the scripts in terms of like around casual and long-term relationships, but I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to one point you made around validation, just in terms of sex and in terms of casual hookups, just a piece where validation is something that we can receive through sexual encounters, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, because what I was thinking while I was listening to that is in that script, you know, I'm a gay man myself, and like, is there something in that script that can we find validation in other places outside of our sexuality, and where and how do we find those things? So I was wondering if in your work, if you can talk a little bit about how that comes into that script or how it's part of it.
Absolutely, thank you. I think we can get validation from many different places. I think it's important, though, to honor that some of us are looking for validation through our sexual experiences, because I think if we jump too quickly to say, hey, this need isn't being met here, you could find it somewhere else, I would worry that we're pathologizing someone's like sexual appetite. Even that term, I think, has a certain connotation to it. So sure, you know, I think what's challenging about validation, and this is one of the nice things I get to explore in individual therapy, is how when you have a casual encounter or any kind of sexual encounter, how does that shift what your ideas about yourself are? So if I think I'm undesirable or unworthy, and I'm hooking up with lots of people, where's the miss? How come I cannot internalize the idea that I am worthy, that I am desirable, right? How come I can't internalize or take in that message? So that's the part that I think is very interesting, because if there's a gap there where you can start to internalize, then maybe I can equally honor other places where I look for validation, right? In friendships, career, exploring interests and activities, because those are also important. But to that end, when we're talking about scripts, we're also talking about a cultural landscape and which opportunities and activities are available, right? So I could become really, really good at lacrosse, but that's not going to be celebrated the same way other things might, right? So I don't want to be, I wouldn't want my idea of trying to pursue something that is celebrated to be undermined either. So we have to think about some of those factors. Thanks.
Hi there. My question is also for LaRon. There is a therapy that some of the social workers or psychologists in the room might have heard of called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I was wondering, ART therapy, how is that different than EMDR? Is it just incorporating EMDR? Are you working, because there are social workers that I know personally who are working in Toronto doing research on that area. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important question. It incorporates eye movement desensitization techniques. So those three I talked about, the imaginal exposure, the re-scripting, and then the eye movement desensitization. I think the, I'm trying to say why I would say it was different. I think there's some ways that, maybe a primary way is the entry point to it. So, and not for everybody, the idea that you don't need to come and tell your story. That doesn't have to be the only way to access treatment. And the idea, I mean, that's sort of why this mental health debriefing, people stopped using it because it was like, tell us what happened again. And so you have to sort of relive that every time. So a different approach to it. And also it is very mechanical. So, which can be a problem, particularly in African communities where narrative can be very important for some of the folks that I work with. But it's not even necessarily about processing the experience, like what happened to you. It's about getting the sensations related to the memory stored in the right place. So in that way, it is very mechanical. And different from some other therapeutic approaches, it gets people to sort of reason what happened, how you feel about it, and how you reconcile it. There's not a lot of reconciliation from that standpoint. It's mechanical, about getting the memory to the place where you can recall it. So you don't erase the memory. It's not a Men in Black type thing. But you can recall it without experiencing those same distressing sensations. So that's how I would describe it.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Hi, hello. Thank you for your presentations, all of you. Raheem, my question is for you. In your presentation, you mentioned, these are relationships for heterosexual people, and then these are relationships for gay people. How do you have conversations around heteronormativity in relationships, establishing or combating gender norms in gay relationships? Because it made me think of people who say mask for mask or no femmes. So yeah.
Absolutely, thanks for that. I think when we're talking about the different ways we're messaged to, I wouldn't want to, if you said to me, I really want to be in a long-term monogamous relationship, we might both be aware that the reason that's difficult is because there's a message around subverting that idea. But if that's what you want, in our individual interaction, whether we're friends or you're my client, I think I want to celebrate that choice. I want to celebrate that. I don't want to put you in a place where I am putting the pressure that essentially comes from like the identity politics and the politics of group representation, and put that on you and say, why do you want to be in a monogamous relationship? Why do you want kids? Why don't you want to resist that, right? So that wouldn't be the pressure that I'm putting on you. I would want to come from a place where I'm celebrating your choices. I think there's some really insidious and toxic things that have come out of cis gay men's communities when we talk about the kinds of masculinity that gets celebrated, the specific types of bodies that are celebrated, not just tolerated. And I think we have to work in a very individualized way with people when it comes to some of these things, because I could be meeting with somebody who spews out a lot of things that are very toxic, and if I go to address that, that might not be client-centered, right? I have to think about, in this interaction, why is this person coming to me, and what is the problem they're working through, right? So I meet lots of clients who say problematic things, but I put that on the back burner, because my assumption is that if I can help you work through your pain, whatever that is, and I'm sure it's there, right? Then later on, you're at a place where there's more empathy that you're able to access, and you can understand why you said that shitty thing you did about whomever, right? So I think in this case, it's meeting with the client where they're at, is focusing on their pain, the thing that they're working on, and being able to celebrate their life choices, right? And not reimposing on them the importance of one of those quadrants that belongs to a script.
It's 12:02, so the lunch is outside. If you have any more questions, maybe the panelists can stick around and answer questions if that's okay, because some people may be hungry. So, yeah, okay. So lunch is outside. Please enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back at the workshop is at 1 o'clock. Thanks.